Today, I want to talk about the paleoconservative versus the neoconservative debates. Why do I want to talk about this? I was with a bunch of friends last Tuesday, and I realized that among younger people, even like people my age and even older, they are not aware of the old dispute that happened really for decades before today, and largely because the paleocons were marginalized over a series of decades, and then decisively, I'd say, in the 80s, which was reflected in the 90s and today. So I think it's just important to understand that history as best as I understand it, and see how it impacts today, how it shapes the dynamics of why people responded to Trump and Vance in the way that they are. So I will try to just describe that history as best that I can. All right. So when we talk about the paleoconservative, neoconservative, let's just talk about some names. So who would be like a paleoconservative? So Patrick Buchanan would be one. Paul Gottfried, people like Clyde Wilson, Mel Bradford. You might think someone like Russell Kirk, and but he wasn't exact. I mean, I guess maybe ideologically he was, but in terms of his friend groups, it seems to me that he was actually more kind of on what became the neocon side. But usually nowadays, paleoconservatives, it's associated principally with Chronicles magazine. Do I have one? Oh, it's right here. Here's the Chronicles magazine right there. August issue. So it's usually associated with that. Maybe like also American Conservative. I don't think they've ever claimed that. So anyway, let's like kind of jump right into the history. This kind of goes back into the post-war period. That is when we talk about post-war, we usually mean that the after World War II. And after World War II, there was a type of conservative resurgence. There already was you can say, an old right conservatism. It was rooted in part in being kind of anti-New Deal. So when you think of the old right in the 20th century, it was the sort of people who, again, opposed FDR. The New Deal was anti-interventionist, even in the 30s and the early 40s. But after World War II, as we all know, things kind of began to change a little bit, right? So you have this new resurgence of conservatism. One thing is interesting about that is they were largely composed of Roman Catholics. This is kind of an aside, I guess, but it's important history. They were Roman Catholics and Jews, and some of the guys I've talked to said that there was a sort of deliberate effort to kind of exclude the Protestants because they thought the mainline Protestantism was essentially going down into liberalism. And in part, they're right, but there was a sort of conscious effort to kind of align themselves with Roman Catholics and Jews. What's interesting about that is that, in a way, the Roman Catholics and the Jews were largely outsiders from American public life. Not that they didn't contribute anything, but that in terms of the actual, it's just an interesting development that the sort of minority outsiders, the people who consider, I mean, even Roman Catholics, they thought themselves as not fully American, or at least not accepted fully. And certainly, this is reflecting the fact there was no Roman Catholic president until JFK. And even that was kind of an issue at the time. So I think it's important in the conservative movement to realize that from the post-war period, you essentially had, in a way, minority groups leading conservatism. Interesting, a lot to say about that, but I'll just leave it at that. But you have this growth of conservatism within the 50s and the 60s, and but the different factions, as I understand it, in the 50s were actually friends, and up into the early 60s. The post-war period's marked by anti-communism among conservatives. So everyone in some way was anti-communist, but they weren't all anti-communist in the same way. And so one of the divides early on was between someone you all probably know, William Buckley or Bill Buckley, and another guy named Robert Welch. Bill Buckley's famous for being one of the founders of National Review, which became kind of a sort of flagship magazine for conservatism, even to this day, even though I'd say it's influence has waned, largely because of Never Trumpism and some of the people they have on there, and also the people funding it. It's not clear who's funding them anymore. So there was that with Bill Buckley. Of course, he had Firing Line and started in '66. But then you have a guy named Robert Welch, and he was the founder of the John Birch Society. Many of you might have heard of the John Birch Society as a sort of anti-Semitic, this and that. But really the dispute that arose, first of all, I'd say that Buckley and Welch were actually friends for a while. They corresponded. This is all kind of public. You can find articles on their correspondence. They wanted to work together. In a way, to my knowledge, the Birchers were more kind of Southern in their kind of fan base. I could be wrong on that, but I get that sense from some of the donors. Welch himself is from North Carolina. Buckley, of course, is sort of New Englander and part of that sort of group. But they were kind of united because they're anti-communism, and there were fears about communist infiltration in the government and also within just different areas of life. But one of the issues that kind of brought them, that began to separate them, was that Robert Welch saw Earl Warren, who was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, as someone who needed to be impeached. Okay, so Earl Warren needed to be impeached. So Earl Warren is what I would say is today's favorite founding father, even though he wasn't a founding father. And he was the guy who brought in, I would say, fundamentally transformed the country. Okay, he fundamentally transformed the country in ways that we are living in today. And it makes it, so just take for the Establishment Clause. So he's the guy who said you can't have, with, of course, the other justices, said that you cannot have a student-led prayer before a high school football game, even if it's non-denominational, even if it's not even explicitly Christian. You cannot have that prayer because that constitutes an establishment of religion. So that's what Earl Warren said. He took prayer to schools in other ways, and really fundamentally transformed, such that if you talk to a nice conservative evangelical people, they will lose their minds if you talk about Sabbath laws and blasphemy laws and school prayer and reading the Bible in school. They're like, oh, we can't do that. That's a violation of the First Amendment. But of course, it wasn't until a bunch of liberal justices said it was unconstitutional. And even National Review, Buckley was against all those court cases as well. But anyway, it fundamentally transformed the country. Welch thought it was a huge deal. So did Buckley think it was a big deal? Well, Welch said, well, we need to impeach Earl Warren. And of course, the National Review side was, well, we need more conservative justices. We need to overrule them. We need to do the political process. And we shouldn't go too far. You see where that's brought us. It's about 60 years later, and there's been some Supreme Court victories, but guess what? There's still no prayer in schools. You still can't do prayers before football games. And all those things that rolled back have essentially the consciousness of even your conservative evangelicals, the people who religiously attend church, are still essentially Warrenites. They don't even know it, but that's what they are. Okay. Anyway, Welch wants to, but this was considered embarrassing to people like Russell Kirk and to people like William Buckley. And also there was, among the Birchers, they had a more conspiratorial mindset that even like the Eisenhower administration and conservative politicians were sympathetic communists. Now, there is something to say about how communism did infiltrate all these aspects of life. Now, was Eisenhower like that? I doubt it. But anyway, the Birchers became a source of a sort of embarrassment for the National Review, and the conservatives of the time, because they wanted to establish themselves as a sort of legitimate, respectable, right-wing, conservative force within politics. And now you have these alliances with these Birchers. So you fast forward a few more years to 64. 64 is when Barry Goldwater ran against Lyndon Johnson. Goldwater said something friendly about the Birchers or Welch, which Buckley lost his mind over that. What happened then, there was a series of articles that Buckley put out at National Review, essentially attacking his old friend and all the people who were the Birchers. And when he did that, he got the praise of the Washington Post praised him, Time Magazine praised him. And it was essentially, I don't know if it was intentional by Buckley, but it was used as, at least in effect, this established these people as like legitimate players. To my knowledge, it was the first time that conservatives attacked people to their right, or canceled essentially people to their right, kicked them out of polite society, and then they were praised by the left for doing so, and that actually was able, then the conservatives were able to get a sort of legitimacy. That's in the mid 60s. Again, then William Buckley gets his firing line in 66. And that goes on until I think 99. So over 30 years, he's doing the firing line, and he has guests. There's a lot of famous episodes, a lot of interesting stuff he did on that. But the Birchers were essentially ostracized. To this day, there is no John Birch Society. Usually when people, they don't know who these people were, but they know they were bad people. So that was kind of the early, I would say the first, to my knowledge, the first purging from the sort of center right to the right with the support and celebration of the left. You kind of see, you'll see a theme as we move forward. Now, from here on, it seems that you have the sort of Rockefeller Republicans, but also that you have the National Review seems to be, they are the conservative voice among conservatism. Again, it's dominated by Roman Catholics. The Protestant mainline is starting to slip farther and farther into liberalism. And to this day, you have what I think Aaron Renn and others have talked about, this sort of Roman Catholic intellectual ethos, and that evangelicals don't have, that Protestants don't have, which is something I've tried to show is to our detriment. We're essentially a voting bloc. I say we're the lone bulwark, which is true, but as a voting bloc. Whereas you look at the Supreme Court, it's full of Roman Catholics. Gorsuch is like a Anglican, but anyway. But there is this sort of ethos, and so conservatism is dominated by Roman Catholics and Jews to this day. Hopefully that'll change in the near future. But anyway, that happens in the 60s. That's the first purging. And then you move on. You have, within the Nixon years, you have the rise of a guy named Patrick Buchanan. Patrick Buchanan was a speechwriter for Nixon. And of course, there's more radical people on the right in the 70s doing from radio shows to other things. But in terms of like the respectable voice, when Buckley has someone like George Wallace on his show on Firing Line, it's very confrontational. Same thing he is when he has lefties on there. He's essentially like the figurehead, I would say, of conservatism, and can attack people from right and left. Well, one of the memorable moments is when Buckley was accused of being a Nazi. And he was accused of being a Nazi, and he really got visibly angry, and he threatened to punch the other guy in the nose. That's the sort of thing we have. So if he was very comfortable about, he was very concerned about maintaining this image of conservatism as essentially what would eventually become a type of anti-racist in a mild sense, and also anti-Nazi. This is the same post-war consensus we've talked about before. He was well within that. Now, he wasn't a full-on neocon as we think of him today. He was opposed to these Earl Warren court rulings. He was early kind of against the Civil Rights Act until he changed his mind, and other things. So we don't want to look at the neocons today and then look back and say that's Buckley. Nevertheless, he did sort of set an ethos. He set the tone, and his people essentially became the gatekeepers of conservatism, and they were that, I would say, until very, very recently. So that's the first episode, which established him as the gatekeeper. Now you move on to the early 80s. In the early 80s, of course, Ronald Reagan became president. And in 81, he was going to appoint someone to the National Endowment for the Humanities. That's an institute that has a lot of money. It's a presidential appointment. They control a lot of funds and grants and all sorts of opportunities. And at first, Reagan was going to appoint a guy named Mel Bradford. Mel Bradford was a Southerner. He was a sort of Southern agrarian, and he was able to, but he was kind of in a way controversial. People accused him of being a neo-Confederate and other things, racist, anti-Semitic, all these things. From what I know, he was actually a sort of serious academic. I mean, he wrote books on the American founders. You can still get his books to this day. Very smart guy, very actually kind man. I just recently talked to actually Paul Gottfried about him, and he's just talked how a wonderful man. And that he wasn't the things he was accused of being. And but anyway, this is 81, I believe, and Ronald Reagan publicly announced Mel Bradford for this, nominate him. Well, the neocons, which now they're becoming neocons, they weren't neocons in the 50s and 60s and all that. Now the neocons are starting to form, and the sort of divide of paleo-neo is forming. Well, all these guys are now becoming, they're opposed to Bradford's appointment. So under pressure then, Reagan cancels or rescinds that nomination, and he appoints a guy named William Bennett. Now, William Bennett is actually still alive, to my knowledge, but that event, that appointment was, I would say, was the decisive fight, but was the decisive act that really kind of killed the paleoconservatives as a major force. I mean, it didn't realize itself until several years later. But with Bennett there, he was able throughout the Reagan administration to give the money, to give the appointments, and all the emphasis on the neoconservatives. Okay, and so the neoconservatives then filled all the respectable spaces. They filled all of the they got all the grant money. And this is when the neocons effectively went to war against the paleocons. I mean, many of the neocons in the past were actually communists themselves, and now they're conservatives. And many of them were former liberals who are now suddenly conservative. But it was a decisive victory. Now, at the time, there was a magazine, like I pointed out, Chronicles magazine existed. I forget what year it came out, but it's been around a long, long time, and it's still alive today. And so that was a major act of gatekeeping that kicked out the paleocons. Now, the paleocons back then, a lot of them were Southerners. Many of them had a strong connection to regionalism. They weren't nationalists. A lot of them actually critiqued nationalism mainly because they saw nationalism as being a New England, some of them would say it's a New England Puritan thing, that they essentially want to make the entire United States in the image of essentially New England liberalism. That's kind of the way they saw it. There's reflections from Reconstruction period, and the Southerners distrusted the sort of power base that was up north, and so the paleocons really wanted to emphasize regional and local identity, and also to oppose a sort of national meddling within local regional politics and social life. Okay. But the neocons weren't having any of that. They wanted essentially to be, I mean, as much as they're opposed to nationalism today, they were, in a way, wanted to further a type of national meddling all the way down. I mean, they were very happy, of course, to see young Southern boys sign up for the military, as we'll see later. Anyway, that was kind of the divide. But again, there was that decisive act against Mel Bradford, again, a nice Southern academic, to replace it with essentially a Northerner. And that was decisive. So the 80s, you have that developing, built up. Now, all this is happening during the Cold War. So everyone against anti-communist, everyone's against the USSR among the conservatives and paleo-neo. But now at the late 80s, early 90s, the USSR falls. Now you just have Russia. Now there's the communism is now located in China, which was weak, and Cuba, which is weak, and Korea, which is weak. But you don't have this powerhouse of the USSR anymore. So now the question is, what are we going to do now? Are we going to then continue this internationalist posture? Because decades, it was just very much this internationalist posture of defeating communism. Okay, well, we won. Now what are we going to do? Are we going to continue with this kind of internationalist posturing with our foreign policy? And are we going to try to enact a sort of Pax Americana, that is the sort of American peace? That we're going to enact, and because of Bennett and because of the neoconservatives, well, the people in the positions of power in academia and bureaucracy, in the media, they were the deck was essentially stacked against the paleoconservatives precisely because they had Chronicles magazine, they had these other things, and so you can guess what it was. You can guess exactly what happened with George Bush Sr. Now, the sort of last breath, the last struggle would be with Pat Buchanan. So remember, Pat Buchanan is the Nixon speechwriter. He was still around doing commentary, good friends with John McLaughlin and the McLaughlin Group, which my father and I used to watch back in the day in the 80s and 90s. That was great. But yeah, so Pat Buchanan, he now runs in 92 and he runs in 96. So he's running initially for president in 92 against Bush within the Republican Party. And he doesn't win any primary, but he gets second in New Hampshire. Nevertheless, he's a sort of paleocon voice. He's speaking against immigration, multiculturalism. He has that famous 92 speech at the convention where he does endorse George Bush Sr., but he endorses, but in that speech, it's called the Culture War speech. He says that now we're in a struggle for the soul of America is one of his famous lines. And this is back in 92. Okay. So, I mean, this is like, there's been over 30 years. And I mean, now we can see Buchanan was absolutely right. So Buchanan, of course, remains a commentator. Bill Clinton wins. And then Buchanan then runs again in 96 in the Republican Party. He does much better. In the primary, I think he wins. I think he wins Missouri. I think he wins Louisiana. I think he wins Alaska. And I think he might have got second or first in New Hampshire. Nevertheless, George Dole won in 96 for the Republican Party nomination. And of course, he lost to Bill Clinton. All right. So at that time, Buchanan's campaign manager is a guy named Samuel Francis. Samuel Francis is considered a paleoconservative. I don't know if he'd like that label. He was kind of I don't know what he'd think about it, but he basically was, you got to have a name for things. And I think he was. And his strategy in the 90s for Buchanan was called this sort of middle American strategy. You've seen people like C.J. Engels talk about this before and recently. The middle American strategy was to say, look, there's a sort of forgotten American, and that's your middle class or lower class or like a working class whites. So even in the 90s, everyone's talking about minorities and capturing the Black vote and the Hispanic vote and the woman vote. And, and they'll be talking about how do we get the interest of the aspiring class, as we call them today. Sam Francis said, look, the winning strategy is to just appeal to these forgotten Americans, which are the middle and lower class whites that live in places like Missouri and Wisconsin and Michigan. You appeal to those people, and then it's a winning strategy. Well, Buchanan did that. Of course, everything was stacked against him, and so he did well in 96. But that was in a way, like after Buchanan lost in 96, it was already done. The paleoconservatives, if I'm wrong, paleocons can, like the older guys can correct me on this, but it seems that they were kind of dead by that point. Not physically, but in terms of a movement. Later, Buchanan in 2000 ran on the Reform Party ticket and didn't do very well at all, and then didn't run ever again. And so at this time in the 90s, this is when you have the growth of talk radio. So you have like Rush Limbaugh started in the 80s, and to his credit, he actually endorsed Buchanan, I think in 92 and 96. I'm not sure about that, but Limbaugh did actually endorse, and during the primary process, he endorsed Pat Buchanan, which is, good on Rush for that. But in the 90s, you have the growth of talk radio, and these guys are generally kind of neoconservatives. And of course, you get the Hannitys, and you get early in that was like Michael Savage was growing and all that in like the Bay Area. All right, so you had the paleocons are gone. Now, who's getting nominated for president in 2000? Well, George W. Bush. What's interesting about that campaign, because I was 17 or 18 or whatever when that was happening. I was very political in high school and watched these things. George W. Bush actually ran against what we call nation building, what they called nation building back then, because Bill Clinton, he basically adopted a very internationalist posture. So this is when you have the Kosovo-ish incidents. Croatia. This is when you have the Mogadishu incident in the 90s. And there was this feeling that, look, like especially after the Mogadishu thing, which if you watch Black Hawk Down, that's what it captures there. There was a sense of we needed to stop nation building. And so in a way, there was signs that maybe we're shifting more to domestic. Maybe we need to stop doing this kind of nation building posture. Maybe there's hope in that. Okay. Of course, George W. Bush won, or was at least handed victory by the Supreme Court in 2000. He takes office in 2001 and appoints Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz and these other neocon guys. Basically, George W. Bush was, at the very least, I don't know, he appointed, everyone was a neocon. There were no paleoconservatives in sight. And after 9/11, the posture of internationalist conservatism just utterly took off. Okay. So of course you have the invasion of Afghanistan, which is kind of limited at first, actually, in late 2001 and then early 2002. Then there's all these debates about should we go and invade Iraq? And the sad thing is, among people on the right, and I remember this because I remember watching Pat Buchanan say, we cannot go to war in Iraq. You guys are crazy. They're not going to accept like our liberal democratic norms. It's going to be a quagmire. Don't you remember what happened in Vietnam? Pat Buchanan's saying all these things. I'm like a 19-year-old kid raised on watching and listening to Hannity and all these neocons. I didn't even know what neoconservatism was at the time. I didn't know about this history. I didn't know that essentially there was a decisive victory, and all that was left was a bunch of internationalist neocons dominated by, Roman Catholics and Jews and all that. But and so I supported the war. I remember it was early 2003. In San Francisco, I went to this protest that was an anti-war protest. Actually, this is 2004, a year after the war started. And I remember still being for the war and pro-George. I'd just become a Christian in 2000. And so I thought the Christian thing to do was to support George W. Bush. I'm a 16-year-old, 17-year-old kid. And so that's what I did to my, at least I guess I have excuse of youth for doing that. Now I, of course, despise all those people. But anyway, yeah, so we go to war in Iraq and it's quagmire, and Pat Buchanan was right. And I recall around 2008, 9, 10, when I had joined active duty Army, I realized that, man, Buchanan was right and I was wrong. I should have listened to Buchanan back then. I thought that I didn't understand the history. I didn't understand what Buchanan represented when he opposed the Iraq War. I didn't know it. And so anyway, I realized this. I don't want to get into my kind of story into where I am now, but that was a moment. But still, even in 2008, 2009, 10, who dominated Fox News? Who dominated on talk radio? Again, all neoconservatives, right? So I mean, to think about it this way, like if the decisive event was like 81 and then the 80s, now we're like 90s neocon era, 2000s neocon era, 2010s, at least the first half. You have John McCain, and then you have Mitt Romney running for president. Both those guys, we know them as hardcore neocons. Of course, they lost, and predictably. And then 2015 comes around. 2015 comes around. And guess who shows up on the scene? Well, Donald J. Trump, right? And he was opposing guys who thought that the only game in town, the only way to get funding, which is still the case, the only way to get good funding is essentially to be a type of conservative internationalist, to be a neoconservative. No one knew this history. That was just what conservatism was until, with a few voices like the American Conservative and others kind of pushing, like Ron Paul and others, but they were all seen as kind of radical. Here's a Donald Trump coming out, and he's saying things about trade and being taken advantage of internationally and stupid wars and caring about America and America first. And the neocons in 2015, they had to, at least the older guys, they had to know what was up. They've heard all of that before, right? They heard it in the 80s, they heard it in the 90s, and then they thought they had won. They thought they had finally defeated these, like, isolationists and these America firsters. We finally defeated them, but yeah, and like, don't you care about Israel and like things like that, right? That's their thinking, right? But here comes Trump. Now, Trump is, I don't know, I don't know like where Trump got his ideas. I don't know. But it doesn't matter if Trump knew what he was saying or what history he was tapping into. The neocons, I think, knew what was up. And actually they did, because in I think it was 2016, 2017, David Brooks, who was a commentator, like a columnist at the New York Times, he wrote a piece saying that, look, the winning strategy for Donald Trump was the same strategy put forward by Samuel Francis in the mid-90s. Samuel Francis, the kind of one of the last paleocons who himself was canceled by conservatives in the mid-90s, and he died in like 03 or 04, something like that. So the strategy that won for Donald Trump was the same strategy for Pat Buchanan that was articulated by Samuel Francis. So again, tapping into this old paleocon thing that they thought was dead. So so Donald Trump wins 2016, and so he does, yeah. And there's all sort of disappointments, and we can talk about how that was not as what we'd hope him to be and all that. But regardless, there was a resurgence, and I think that was largely, again, because they thought the paleocons were coming back. And in a way, I have to say they have. Weekly Standard, that magazine, is dead. That's gone. National Review is mocked as the outlet that does the conservative case for, trans or something like that. Everyone like David French, that warmonger fool, is now New York Times, essentially writing against just basic, and now he's like pro Kamala Harris. So what's happened and more than this, though. So it's not just that now they're opposed to paleocons. The neocons have gone to essentially become allies with the left, which they always, in an informal way, were allies with the left. You remember this goes back to when Buckley canceled the Birchers. He attacks the Birchers, gets praised by Times and the Washington Post. And then they gain the respectability that they have now, or they had it for decades. And now they ally with the left today, but now it's almost in a formal way. Now, like the New York Times and Washington Post are like, hey, we need to bring more of these conservatives in, put them within our papers. And guess what? What's their job in these left-wing outlets? What's David French's job? What's Max Boot's job? What's some of those other guys? Their job is essentially attack the right from a left-wing publication. So it's essentially formalized what was informal before. All right. The problem is, though, that this moment is different. This moment's different. I think it's exemplified in the fact that Trump chose JD Vance as his running mate, as the VP. That's important. And then Vance did that speech where he says, "United States is not simply an idea; it's our home. It's a people and a place and a heritage." People reacted very negatively against that. I mean, like Ben Shapiro, of course, reacted against that, and other people like other neocons and the left all kind of united in criticizing the idea that, well, the idea of home sounds Nazi and it sounds fascist. And really what Vance is articulating there, and I don't know if, again, I think if he knows it or doesn't know it, or it's kind of seeping in through his new right influences, that's old paleoconservatism. I mean, it's kind of got a national home sense to it. But the idea of home, the idea of place, the idea of a people and a heritage and a history, that's old paleoconservatism in opposition to what became the neoconservatives, who were very internationalist, who believed in the propositional nation idea, and that's it. who were they're pro-immigration because we need a better workforce and they can assimilate into our ideas and principles. And then you have the Jaffaites who kind of emphasize the founding as an idea, and the Lincoln kind of finally bringing it back, bringing in the promises of the propositional nation, that sort of idea. Vance says home, people, place, heritage, and everyone loses their minds about it. Again, that's just and it's a direct. It's restoring that old battle, but now with muscle, and also more than that, with intellectual power. We haven't made inroads into a lot of popular media. There's a lot of kind of ridiculous, kitschy, cringy stuff that you see in the Trump side. But with the intellect, there's an intellectual powerhouse behind this. And we need to see it what it is. And the reason they're trying to do all this cancellation, the reason why the neocons want to destroy Trump and destroy Vance is precisely because this is what they do. And they thought they won. And this is a sort of they're sort of breaching the lines of the neocons, which they never thought would happen before. And so we need to keep this history in mind. That's why they wanted to defeat everyone. But I mean, even think of like Russell Moore, these other guys who are praising Liz Cheney on the evangelical side. The evangelicals, going even back to the 90s, you have, what's his name, Reed. What's the guy's first name? Some of you guys in the chat will tell me what his name is. Not Russell Reed. Anyway, the moral majority. So you have the moral majority of the Falwells. And then the 90s essentially wedded the evangelical voting bloc with the Republican Party, which at the time was neoconservative. Okay. And that was reflected in my 2001 sense that to be a good Christian voter is to support George W. Bush in 2000. And that's continued up into this day. The guys who were doing political commentary, like Russell Moore and other guys, and you see their quotes and all that from those times, they seemed like they were good conservatives. Well, really, they were just part of a movement that was attached to a neoconservative movement and the neoconservative dominance, like all these guys do. Like, of course, Russell Moore, people say he's a political operative. It's towards the power base. They're fixed in that power base. So why do you have all these sort of old guard conservatives now seemingly moving over to the left and attacking Trump and Vance and all these guys? Well, that's because they're essentially just the evangelical arm of neoconservatism. That's their people. That's their power base. That's their source of invitations and money and all that sort of thing. That's their people. So they're essentially, they're just moving along with their people as they oppose the paleoconservatives. So anyway, that is my main history. I don't think I forgot anything. Maybe I did. And I think it's very important to understand this history, because it's been forgotten, and people wonder what's happening in like American conservatism with these different ideas and opposing national interventionism, talking about maybe a sort of national policy for industry, being very against multiculturalism, talking about home, being against immigration, seeing like these destructive forces at work within our politics, seeing people seemingly more committed to foreign countries than their own country. What is all this? I mean, all those dynamics. What is it? It's just another incarnation of the old neocon, paleocon. And if we understand the history and understand who we're basically a part of, we can, I think, we can understand why the neocons have responded, and also to say, look, there are resources and people, and that we can appeal to in the past to develop this movement. Now, I would say, as sort of aside, that we as Protestants need to look deeper in a way into our past, not just in the old paleocons or the old right, but see ourselves as this country as Protestant and move and become sort of intellectual force ourselves instead of just a voting bloc that conservative Roman Catholics use to get policies. Which I'm not like I'm friends with Roman Catholics and I'm friends with Jews who are kind of paleoconservative on my side. So I'm not counter-signaling them, but we as Protestants need to see ourselves as more just this anti-intellectual sort of voting bloc, but actually take assert ourselves as intellectual force. But all right, I'm going to leave it at that.